lead in mental health for the University of Wolverhampton. Next up, we've got Fionna McLauchlan, who is a PhD student at KCL, who is researching care experienced young people and decision making in HE. And then finally, we're going to be hearing from Tanya Marwaha, founder of young people's mental health charity championing youth minds. So I hope everyone feels today leaving inspired and leaves feeling informed as well. We're going to have some time for Q&A with our speakers later on, and then Dr Sam Holmes, Causeway's CEO, will be coming on to give a bit of an update and a reminder about the PG Cert as well. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Clare Dickens. Clare, if you would like to take the stage.
Thank you, Claire. I'll just try and do the share screen thing. See if we can get that going. Can everybody see my slides?
Yeah.
Can you see that, Claire?
All good.
Yeah, brilliant, that's smashing. Welcome everybody. Thank you to Claire and colleagues for inviting me along to talk today. I'm Clare Dickens. I'm the University of Wolverhampton's academic lead for mental health and wellbeing, and probably one of the proudest aspects of my role is also that I chair Wolverhampton's suicide prevention multi-stakeholder forum, whereby multiple forms of resource get together with the view to conceive what the city's action plans are, with a commitment to then do something about it. It's an absolute privilege, and I think that most of what drives that effort for me is that my kids are growing up in Wolverhampton, and I want it to be safe for them. Anywhere where they may go and need support, I want somebody to have the same level of confidence to be able to offer that support and intervention should they so need it. When looking at how I was going to approach this topic today, having spoken with Claire, I possibly want to leave you with a few more questions than I do possibly solutions, because I think our agenda's littered with far too many alleged experts who very often we assume we know what's needed, put more things on offer, and then get quite annoyed when people don't take them up and utilise the support that we then put on offer. So we'll go through a bit of a critical exploration, a brief one if I can possibly do that, and really ask the question, where does this alleged crisis lie when it comes to mental health and well-being? So that point exactly really in terms of any questions that emerge. Hopefully by the end of my brief session, you'll have more questions than you will have solutions, but offering that time, space and place within your practice and within your context to think about the role that you have to play around mental health and well-being, and that you don't have to be an alleged expert to have this on your radar. We need to democratise the vision, in my view, of mental health and wellbeing, and particularly within my realm of suicide prevention. I suppose it would be easy for me to start off offering some statistical prevalence around the increased mental health and wellbeing issues and present that as a crisis. And if you want statistical indulgence, we can say that pre-pandemic, we know that suicide is a common cause of death amongst young people. Worldwide, you know, more people have died by suicide than all the wars and the homicides combined in our collective history as a species. We know in the UK, it's the commonest cause of death for a man under the age of 49, and it's one of the most commonest causes for a woman to be admitted to a medical ward at the moment in the UK. And I can never say the stat without developing a lump in my throat that suicide is amongst the commonest cause of death for children in England at the moment between the ages of 5 and 15. But when we focus in on statisticals and epidemiological efforts, it almost forces us to not hear the stories of hope, for the stories of the individuals who've not only survived but are also thriving. And I think we need to pay as much attention to those stories with the view to inform what it is that we're doing when it comes to how we plan for mental health and well-being within our contexts. And that's probably one of the most valuable developments and progressions really through within my own practice, within the work that I do around mental health and well-being, but also obviously suicide prevention. In terms of listening to the stories, giving people an opportunity to communicate through a means in which they prefer to talk about their mental health and well-being within their particular context. So one example here is of the Support Life Wolf, who was part of the Wolves in Wolf Sculpture Trail in Wolverhampton, which was donated to our forum of suicide prevention practitioners and survivors, and those who are also bereaved. And they developed this. And that led us on to then develop an art exhibition that focused in on mental health and well-being and suicide prevention. And I think the impact of that in terms of communicating some of these principles through a different means of merely just, you know, statistics, as opposed to stories, was really, really important. And there's one testimony there from a gentleman who visited the exhibition who argued that he was going to take his own life today, and this exhibition saved my life. So, you know, that's very much something that guides my particular practice, and hopefully enables some sentiments within yours around this principle of co-production. But not only co-production, but co-exploration. I don't think we can continue to assume we know what the problems are without asking the people we aim to support. And in doing so, we need to invite the power of their imaginations to conceive a future that involves them, a future that actually plans for them and offers them the support that they feel they need, that will enable them to both flourish and also grow within our particular contexts, particularly when we're looking at higher education and foundation education as young adults progress through their journeys. So I am a mental health nurse by background, so very much most of my practice, I've got to be honest, if I reflect, very much sat at the doing to or doing for end of the spectrum within my early years. And again, I very much reflected on the benefit and the empowerment that emerges through co-exploration, co-design and co-production. But I think we need to not assume we know what it is. We need to ask of the experiences of being involved in co-production going forward. So this crisis that you might have heard in terms of that's on the horizon when it comes to mental health and well-being, I think we need to take a bit of a step back, if I'm speaking candidly, and expose where the crisis lies and explore that potentially it isn't related to increased disclosures. If I look at, you know, my work within higher education, there's a tenet of narrative that discusses the crisis in higher education in relation to mental health and well-being, in relation to increased disclosures. But when I look at the narrative within public health campaigns, within mental health awareness, it's very much promoted and sold the message to individuals to talk, to speak up, to tell people when we're struggling. So maybe the crisis doesn't lie in the fact that more people are now doing that. Maybe the crisis lies in the fact that it's exposed some of the deficit in how we're actually responding to those individuals who require timely and compassionate intervention at the time they do arguably disclose. And I've just used a segment of some examples there, some of the mental health campaign narrative. You know, 1 in 4 of us will experience a mental health difficulty. Well, I much prefer to conceive that 4 in 4 of us, every one of us has mental health. Put enough pressure on it and it may break. And every one of us exists somewhere on a continuum. Looking at men's mental health campaigns, many young men I speak to would argue that some of these campaigns are almost counterintuitive, that can make them feel worse, that they don't really know what's expected of them anymore. So though from the best of intentions, I think that we really need to work with these individuals who we aim to support and promote and develop that Indigenous based awareness of what support they arguably want and what they would arguably benefit from. Another thing that I'm minded of within the mental health and wellbeing arena and awareness campaigns is this principle of othering. And, you know, this 1 in 4 tenet, this principle of only focusing in on diagnostic categories to discuss mental health and well-being, for me, in practical and operational terms, can lead to this. And I've lost count of the amount of times I've heard this within my context as a practitioner within education and within clinical practice. This principle of, I've got one of yours here. somebody who's been identified as maybe struggling, somebody who's put their hand up and made the bravest of steps to come forward and seek support and trust the people around them, to then be told potentially this. And I always conceive what that communicates to that individual at that point. So my response would always be to push back at that point and say, well, which one? And isn't, in this democratised vision of mental health and well-being, everybody's concern? And we all have our own individual roles to arguably play. Another thing that young people and many of the individuals who I've spoken to report to me through their stories and their experience is that they're navigating language and thresholds that just simply will not flex for them when it comes to this particular agenda. And that if you're identified as high risk, you get everything. And for some individuals, support that they don't want. Some individuals, support that's against their better will. And then for the individuals who we deem to be low risk, very often get sent away with nothing. And these thresholds, the principle in between these two thresholds of high and low risk, simply will not flex and meet them halfway. And again, many people have reported to me that they're almost forced to assimilate and perform to this narrative just to be heard, just to be taken seriously. So I think it's a point of reflection here for us to conceive how we go about in terms of creating systems, thresholds and support systems that don't block people out, that embrace them and welcome them in. And conceive, as I've already alluded to, the fact that every one of us exists somewhere on a continuum around mental health and well-being. View us through a strengths-based lens. Even for the individuals who maybe struggle regularly, they are truly remarkable. They have a 100% survival rate of surviving their distress. They are phenomenal, and we have so much to learn from them in that context, so much to learn from their story. Because when we take that compassionate approach, it gets me to conceive that though probably on a metaphysical level, we're probably more alike than we're unlike in how we respond to distress and how our brain interacts and sends the messages that are required for us to be prompted into action. On an individual level, we're never to be repeated again. Many would say, thank goodness, Clare Dickens will never be repeated again, but nor will any of you. And I think that's really quite profound. It's profound in the sense that though I might not float everybody's boat, though I might not be happy necessarily with how life is going, I do have a damn right to be here, and I have a right to be considered as an individual and not to be stood out as different in that at the same time. So I suppose moving on now for me in terms of just to offer some summation and conclusions, or in conclusions, should I say, in terms of this particular context within your practice, that if any of what's been discussed today has prompted any fear, let that be the catalyst for courage. To know that some of that discomfort that you feel around this particular agenda should be used with a commitment to do something about it, and let that be the catalyst, as noted, for your courage around this particular agenda. For me, the due regard for mental health and wellbeing is a necessity. It's not a luxury. It should not be a continued bolt-on to provision. It should be considered at the design and dissemination of everything that we arguably do. And that's not to say that we make everything, easy and not challenging, but there to support and not invite unnecessary stresses. Within this agenda of mental health and wellbeing, very often there are some voices that are louder than others. Some people who, when we go through an epistemic triage of considering who's the expert, tend to get heard more, and we consider them the leads in this particular area. And I call nonsense on that notion, to be quite frank. And I'd argue that we shouldn't wait to lead. Every one of us should lead now, and lead well, because there's always somebody there that's looking up to us. And for me, leadership within this arena isn't a position or a title, it's action and everyday example. Within your teaching and learning context and your career development within this agenda, I'd argue to remain humble and retain your teachable spirit. It's perhaps what's elicited most interest within this area for me. And that principle of lifting others as we climb, the individuals who may be much further upstream within their careers, who need that lift from us. the question really is, can we move to a more inclusive and democratised vision of mental health and well-being, where based on our own role and our own function within society, we can conceive mental health and well-being through our lens. And then the challenge is for us to connect these multiple forms of resource with the view to conceive what we offer to individuals and indeed to ourselves. How can we avoid the pitfall of singular ways of viewing and offering prevention for mental health and well-being? And what I'm saying here is that not avoiding the compulsory pull to pathology around mental health and well-being, or inviting the proverbial horse to bolt. If we continue to focus in on systems and processes that can merely just scoop people up once they're broken and they're not feeling well, we've missed a trick here in terms of the prevention and the intervention and the support much further upstream for somebody. And I suppose I'd leave you with one last question here, that, you know, what does mental health and well-being actually mean to you? What do you need to lead a happy and a healthy life? And is mental health and well-being merely the absence of distress or ill health? I'd ask the question, are the ingredients for mental health and well-being the same for all of us? And at the moment, who owns the definitions that we're working to anyway? Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Claire. That was really fascinating stuff. I'm going to move straight on to our next speaker now. For those of you who've just joined, welcome. We're going to be having some Q&A with our panel of speakers at the end of our third and final presentation today. So Fiona, please can I welcome you into the session?
Thanks, Claire. Bear with me 1 second whilst I also figure out how to share my screen. There we go.
Yeah, I can see that.
Can you see that? And then
yeah,
let's go from the beginning. There we go. Brilliant. So thank you so much to Causeway for inviting me to take part today. As they said, I'm a doctoral researcher at King's College London, and I also mentor young people with Causeway on their university applications. And thank you to Claire for kicking off the discussion today on such an important topic. So the idea for the presentation today on mental health, wellbeing and widening participation really stems from a discussion that I had with the Causeway programs team last year about how we can best support the young people that we work with and how best that we can safeguard them. Because throughout the pandemic, we found that the online mentors who support young people with their university applications were reporting back to us that young people were telling them that they were experiencing anxiety and poor mental health around the school closures, concerns about exams, and general concerns about the future in the context of the pandemic. So we really wanted to understand more broadly whether these experiences were being shared beyond the young people that we work with. So our programme officer, Ed Hill, kindly shared with us these statistics from the Prince's Trust Youth Index report, which was an online survey of 16 to 25-year-olds in the UK. And the survey makes it really clear that young people's mental health and well-being had taken a huge toll during the pandemic, and 50% had reported that their mental health had worsened since the pandemic. 24% had said that they felt the pandemic had destroyed their career aspirations. And 60% of young people had said that they felt getting a job felt impossible now due to the increased competition and the changes in the economy. And the findings were particularly stark for young people who weren't in education, employment or training. Young people we know that can often come from more disadvantaged groups. And they expressed higher levels of anxiety and feelings of insecurity. However, the survey also found that young people were optimistic, both for the year ahead and for their generation's potential. And this led to discussions about how, as widening participation professionals, could we support the positive mental health and well-being of the young people that we work with. So we wanted to discuss today mental health and well-being as a different lens through which to look at the barriers that we know through research and practice tend to affect underrepresented groups and access to HE, and to consider how we can adapt to this context and the challenges that have been brought around by COVID. So this presentation will look at the common barriers that are regularly tackled by widening participation teams and professionals, such as attainment at Key Stage 4, that sense of belonging in higher education, and financial concerns. I'll be considering these 4 questions. Like, what do we know about these barriers? Who do they affect? Is there any new evidence in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic? And following on from Claire's presentation, like, what questions should we be considering about our own practice? Like, how can we be thinking about mental health and well-being in our own role? And I think the important caveat is that we're not trying to be experts, and we really think that it's more about how can we mainstream thinking about mental health and well-being into our own role, and that it's not a replacement for well-funded and high-quality mental health and student support services. So moving on to thinking about what some of the barriers to accessing higher education can be, we know that attainment at Key Stage 4 at secondary school is a key determinant of participation in HE, and that the effect of schools on HG choice is most likely explained by a school's influence on that Key Stage 4 attainment. And in terms of who does this affect, we know that pupils eligible for free school meals are less likely to achieve the attainment that they need to progress to level 3 qualifications and then on to higher education. And that prior attainment can be a barrier for young people who've experienced educational disruption during their childhood, such as young people who have experience of the care system or young carers. However, it's important to note that these issues are cross-cutting, and that often these barriers are experienced through intersections of other demographic characteristics, such as gender, class, race, and ethnicity. And within the context of COVID-19, we know that young people were experiencing anxiety around missed learning, school closures, and exam cancellations, and that it was discussed very early on that school closures were likely to reverse the progress gap that had been made between disadvantaged pupils and their peers. So a study was carried out by an organisation called Impact Ed, who did some longitudinal research with over 60,000 young people during the pandemic in the UK. And they found that pupils who were studying for those exam qualifications were reporting lower levels of well-being. 25% of Key Stage 4 pupils had said that they couldn't get help from family if they had questions about schoolwork, and 40% had said that they didn't have a routine to help them learn at home. So as widening participation professionals, what questions can we be asking about our own practice and how that we can support young people with positive well-being and mental health around this area? So some questions I had around my own practice as an application mentor and as a graduate teaching assistant in a university. Like, how best could we support students who didn't get experience of sitting formal exams at GCSE? This could be an area that young people are really quite concerned about. And how could we build support and guidance into programs and activities that we know provoke anxiety or worries about the future? How can we be proactive in thinking about mental health and well-being? And if you've got any questions of your own or reflections, please add them to the chat. It would be really interesting to hear about your own practice and any reflections that you have. Another barrier that as widening participation professionals we're often thinking about is how some young people can feel lower levels of a sense of belonging in higher education. So belonging can mean lots of different things, but I think it's quite commonly understood in the HE space as that feeling of acceptance, value, or inclusion in HE, and it's been positively associated with motivation and academic success. So an applicant's feeling of belonging in relation to HE institutions can be really quite important in that HE decision-making process, and a lack of a sense of belonging has been linked to poor experiences of transition into HE and considerations of withdrawal from HE in first years of study. And as with attainment at Key Stage 4, like that poor sense of belonging in HE is often experienced by intersections of class, gender, race and ethnicity and disability, and can impact the ways in which underrepresented groups feel those barriers in HE. So for example, commuter and local students can experience lower levels of belonging. And there's been a really interesting study by London Higher that found that the longer the commute, the more likely first year students were wanting to drop out. And that also students who apply and enter to HE with vocational qualifications can sometimes need support with academic skills development and inclusive language related to pathways that aren't just focused on A-levels. Or that young people with caring responsibilities may need personalised, flexible and academic and pastoral support. to feel that sense of belonging in higher education. So what about that question of belonging in this context of COVID-19? Because we know that due to these restrictions, HE outreach has been pushed online, and that during recent UCAS cycles, the ways that young people could explore HE has been limited, and this has likely affected students' capacity to fully explore their options in the ways that they would before and access information, advice and guidance about studying in HE. And this could be a really significant issue for that feeling of belonging if students are progressing to institutions or courses that may not be right for them, and that can affect their sense of belonging and ultimately their well-being and happiness in HE study. So there was a poll by the Sutton Trust that found that 29% of applicants at state schools were unsatisfied with the support that they had received about their application to higher education, and that 36% had reported feeling that they weren't prepared or ready to start the university year. There was also an interesting study from the Centre of Education and Youth and Aspire to HE into young people in the Black Country and Telford and Wrekin, and they found that those young people were feeling less informed about their post-18 options, and that was a result of the school closures, and that they then felt more reliant on family and friends for information, which you know for studies can sometimes be less reliable. And they were also concerned that the lack of social interactions that they'd had during lockdowns and school closures would make that post-18 transition more difficult, again raising concerns about what young people's well-being might be like once they're at university. So what questions again can we ask about our own practice as widening participation professionals? Perhaps how can we support young people to build social networks, or should we be providing more skills on academic skills pre-entry to make people feel included and supported in the academic environment? Or perhaps how can we support the well-being of students who may not have had the chance to visit campus before? Perhaps they've only been able to explore that option online. And lastly, thinking about financial concerns, we know that this is a very, very clear barrier to HE for some young people, and that concerns about student finance, debt and cost of living has been quite well researched in terms of how it can influence higher education choices. And we also know that those costs associated with higher education study can quite rightly be considered as a risky investment, because we know that a job or perhaps academic success isn't 100% guaranteed. So term time working has also been shown to have a negative effect on students' attainment in HE. So we know that there's a strong evidence base about financial concerns. And in terms of who does this affect, again, we know that concerns about cost are cross-cutting, but that studies are focused in particular on how students from low participation neighbourhoods and low income families are more likely to have those concerns about finance and costs. And that also students from low socioeconomic backgrounds are more likely to rely on that term time, part-time work that we know from research can affect their attainment in higher education. But it's also really important to point out that some young people, such as young carers, often have financial concerns because they can't access that part-time work to make them feel more financially secure due to the caring responsibilities that they have at home. And that some young people with insecure immigration status can't access student finance, so may need specific financial support from the university. And we know that without a doubt, in the context of COVID-19, that young people have been severely affected by the job losses during the pandemic. In 2020, one in 10 16 to 25-year-olds had lost a job, and the study by the Centre for Education and Youth in the Black Country and Telford and Wrekin found that young people were adjusting their aspirations for HE in relation to feeling concerned that they might not be able to access a part-time job at work. And also a study found that the majority of care experienced in exchange students in the summer of 2020 were really concerned that they weren't going to be able to pay all of their bills over that summer. So there's a lot of really important questions about how we can adapt and consider our own practice in this area. We're very used to talking to students about student finance, but are we aware of all the grants that we can signpost young people to? Have our resources on student finance been updated in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic? Again, thinking of ways that we can be proactive in supporting students perhaps to feel less anxious or concerned about some of the aspects that we know can cause poor well-being. that's everything for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fiona. Two rather different but equally thought-provoking talks so far there, so thank you very, very much. Again, welcome if you've joined us throughout that talk. We're going to be having 10 minutes for Q&A after we hear from Tanya. So Tanya, if I can welcome you to the session. And Tanya is the founder of young people's mental health charity Championing Youth Minds.
Sorry, Fiona, can I just ask you to unshare your screen so I can share mine, please?
Yes, bear with me 1 second. I figure out how to do this. There we go. Stop share.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Just give me a second. Okay. And
That's great, Tanya. I can see that.
okay, perfect.
All good.
So hello everyone, as Claire mentioned, I'm the founder of Championing Youth Minds, and we really became a group during the pandemic. So we're talking March 2021, so earlier this year. And a lot of kind of our behaviours and actions have been in response to the great situation that has been inflicted on young people, and especially their mental well-being. So as you can see, our kind of slogan, I guess, is young people helping young people care for their mental well-being. So you'll be hearing kind of from a youth perspective. For myself, I'm a student. I was in university during the time of the pandemic, and personally having struggled with my mental health, I really realized how this problem was becoming more and more widespread, and how we were highlighting all of these existing issues in the mental health support and services for young people. And it really made me reflect on what I can do as an individual. So kind of the essence of what I'll be talking about is, on an individual level, what can we be doing to support this issue? So as you can see, this slide is a very, very small snapshot of lots of different headlines posted during the pandemic, post-pandemic, during lockdown, about the impact on youth mental health. So talking about schools, not being able to access school, not being able to access mental health services because their waiting list was so long, and the referral numbers just doubling over time. And we're aware that the NHS is definitely overwhelmed with the amount of referrals coming through. There are not enough resources, there is not enough money being put through, but unfortunately it's one of those situations where we have to wait for a top-down approach to occur, and that is in the hands of our government. But it really made me reflect on these very disturbing kind of headlines. These aren't the things we want to be seeing, but what can I do on an individual level, and what can you do on an individual level to really kind of put something out there for young people to support them with their mental well-being? So I firstly kind of conducted research in my local town, Worthing, but I realized soon that these current issues were prevalent across the United Kingdom and also internationally. So kind of three key trends, and I think these are something that you can pick up in any kind of mental health literature during the COVID-19 pandemic. So, high demand on existing services, talking about, double the amount of referrals from pre-pandemic to during the pandemic to CAMS and local mental wellbeing services. And a lot of, adults, teachers, carers were their feedback was that they're unable to identify warning signs in time. So, we see, unfortunately, that a young person has gone missing and they've unfortunately taken their life, but we are unable to, fully give that support while they are kind of building up to that point. Is that because we are unable to identify, red flags? When are we intervening with support? And lastly, that individuals, so young people themselves, need greater support when and if unavailable to receive professional help immediately. And I think that's where, you know, as working in widening participation, that's where your kind of role is really important, to provide that greater support during a time where a young person may be waiting 6 months or a year to gain professional medical help for their mental well-being, or if they are just struggling on a daily basis. And I think one thing we can all resonate to after lockdown and after these last 2 years is that we've all struggled with our mental health in some way. Is very unique to everyone, but we all have that experience of, you know, feeling low for no reason, and we can't really pinpoint where, feeling frustrated, you know, really questioning, you know, what is the point? We all have had those experiences. So I think kind of COVID-19, although it has brought all of these negative things to light, it has definitely, hopefully, increased the amount of understanding and empathy that we can have between each other. So kind of on a personal level, what can we do to kind of bridge this problem? First one is conversation. So even just being able to sit here and have this conversation about the impact on young people's mental well-being during the pandemic. So, you know, what can you do? Infographics and leaflets, there is so much on the internet. On the left-hand side is just some examples of the type of things we do. Podcasts and blogs for young people to be able to voice their own stories, but also leveraging the use of social media in a positive way. So what kind of educational content is there out there for young people's mental well-being that, as professionals in the widening participation area, that you can leverage? And I think it's important to note that a lot of young people from different cultural backgrounds have never had these conversations about mental well-being. So for example, myself, I'm from an Indian descent, and mental health is a conversation we've just never had in our family. And you know, it's very fortunate that some young people are growing up and have these conversations with their parents, but it's important to know, especially with working with students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, that maybe, you know, their family doesn't believe in mental well-being, mental health. Sometimes it's just something that no one wants to speak about. So kind of how can we, you know, encourage that conversation in a safe and healthy environment? Secondly, awareness. So kind of building up on that point, growing up, I had never even heard the term mental health. I didn't know what depression and anxiety was. And that is a case for a lot of different students around the UK and a lot of different young people. And I remember when I would ask my parents, you know, what is this? What is that? They would just say, oh, I don't know. It's just something which certain people have. You know, there's that marginalization of young people, just any people in our society who do suffer with their mental health. That was definitely the case pre-pandemic. But I think now that during this time, we've grown to understand that it's not just a small sector of our society that are struggling with their mental health. It is all of us at different points of our life, in different ways, and to different levels. So it's really about raising that awareness, you know, signposting young people to the appropriate resources and services, social media content about other organizations. We're fortunate to be in a world right now where it's so easy to connect with services and support networks just from sitting in our room with a click of a button. So let's use that in a positive way. Let's really signpost them out to young people. And now that we've all gotten used to doing Zoom calls, like sitting like this, a lot of services now offer kind of online virtual services, which obviously helps with the accessibility of the services, but also really helps with the fact that there aren't any financial barriers. You don't have to worry about transport to getting to the service. A lot of services like ourselves, we don't charge anything, it's absolutely free. So we really want to remove those financial barriers from accessing mental well-being support. And finally, skills and strategies. So what can we do? What can we teach young people that they don't necessarily learn during school? They don't learn through the standard curriculum. What can we teach them on a personal development side, on understanding themselves better, which will not only help them navigate themselves through their journey up until higher education, but also to be able to give them that confidence that, you know, even if I am for example, only came to this country a few years ago, or I'm from a culture which is not, you know, everyone's kind of doing the same type of thing. I'm the first one in my family to go to university, things like that. How can we instill the confidence in young people who we see through widening participation? So for example, we were running a 10-week free summer workshop program, and it was really simple things like, how can you understand how you're feeling at the end of the day? How can you leverage music to really understand how you're feeling? And I think for young people, it's those small daily things that can make a difference. Once again, social media. I know there's that notion of social media is bad for young people, but let's face it, young people aren't going to remove themselves from social media. So let's use that in a positive way and flip it on its head and really understand about how we can use that to support young people. And there's so many kind of mentoring groups from older students or graduates who had been from, you know, low socioeconomic backgrounds, specific cultural groups, maybe young carers, maybe disabled students who have gotten through that higher education journey and have come out the end, and they're offering some amazing free mentoring opportunities or online content that is out there for, you know, young people who they see themselves in, and infographics and free posters for school. So how can you make the area surrounding the young people to really give them that boost? So, you know, just understanding the value of looking after yourself. I think education, especially higher education, is such a stressful time, and particularly during the pandemic when no one knows what's going on. You don't, you know, you need to choose your subjects, you need to choose your career path. It's extremely overwhelming. And how can you take care of yourself during that? And this slide just has an overview of all the different organizations, services, charities that, you know, focus on youth mental well-being. And I think it's really important that the most kind of effective projects have come from collaboration. So we've seen many of these groups collaborate to, you know, provide that support to young people or specific groups of young people. So for example, I suffer from long-term health conditions. So there's like the Mind and Me Too collaborated to provide support for disabled students accessing higher education. Or for example, students from low socioeconomic backgrounds in London kind of access specific support through mentoring schemes like Fiona mentioned. And lastly, is just this message of hope. And I think kind of from what you've heard today, it probably leaves you with a lot of points to think about, you know, how has the nature of the challenges for young people changed, and what is being done and what needs to be done. But, you know, it can be frustrating to think we need more resources, we need more funding into our services. But in the meantime, what can we do as individuals to really support that? And I think the position that you all are in, working in widening participation, sometimes you are very, very in, you know, the students you work with may look up to you. They may really go to you for advice. They see you as mentors. They see you as, you know, someone guiding them through this journey. So really being able to give them that essence of hope and that confidence inside them will really help. And I think especially after this pandemic, I think every young person needs that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanya. I'm seeing a lot of love coming in through the messages, which is great. Some really positive stuff in there, and I'm sure it's motivated a lot of people in the room as well. As I said, at Causeway, we are always so delighted when we hear the feedback that our programmes offer that hope, that confidence and that self-belief as well, alongside the IAG. If anyone has any questions, we have 7 or 8 minutes before we welcome Sam to give an update and some information about the PG Cert. Please do pop them in the chat alongside the name of the speaker you would like to answer. Just give everyone a minute or two to digest everything we've just heard. Can see some comments, but not too many questions. What we get a lot of thanks in there as well. Brilliant talks. Sam, do you want to give a quick update on the PG Cert and give people time, and then if there's any questions we can take them at the end?
Yeah,
brilliant.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So yeah, I just really want to make the point that today's event is part of a series of sessions designed to launch our upcoming postgraduate certificate in access, outreach and social mobility, as Claire mentioned earlier. I just want to pull out a few features of the session today which showcase how we're going to be working on that PG Cert. So first of all, as you all know, the topic we've been looking at today is specific and absolutely current, but it also links to the wider ongoing issue of barriers to social mobility, which is our core concern. And that is a key feature of the PG Cert. We'll be looking at various different aspects, but that core thread of barriers to social mobility is going to be the central concern. Today also we've heard different academic and practical perspectives, a range of ideas, but as Clare Dickens said right at the start, no answers. There's loads of answers, but there's no single answer and there's no simple answer. And that again is a feature of obviously the academic approach that we'll be taking on the PG Cert. And the last point I'd make is we're leaving you with a tool to take away. So this is something that Fiona's put together, and it will be emailed to all of you afterwards. This is to help support your own reflection. So Fiona put some really useful questions into her presentation, and she's framed a nice document with some of the key stats and messages and points from her presentation that you can work through to help you reflect on your practice and hone your practice in your own context. So do keep an eye out for that email. And do also have a look at the information about the PG Cert itself, which we'll send around again. It really is a unique opportunity and a chance for you to get incredible support in your professional role. It's a fantastic context for you to read more, think more, reflect more, but crucially talk to other practitioners from across different parts of the sector. So universities, schools and colleges, corporates as well, with outreach schemes and charities. So do please look up that information if you haven't already.